Hi, everybody. I am so excited that you're here with us today at LudoNarraCon 2023. We're all full of just a lot of exciting narrative games. This one is a panel called Memory, Society, Hope, and Heartbreak by Marginalized Protagonists. What we're talking about today is that marginalized characters can humanize narratives that criticize oppression, question historicity, and search for a common ground and a sense of belonging. How do concepts of hope and authenticity play into game devs' creative processes to bring characters' complex roles to life? Join us from 1000 Times Resist, Sephonie, Solace State, and Venba as they discuss how their game's diverse characters are designed to explore new worlds, dystopias, post-apocalypses, and modern migrations. So I'll let us introduce ourselves because we're the devs here, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Hello, I'm Marina Ayano Kitaka, she, her pronouns, and I am the artist, writer, and designer at Analgesic Productions. I'm the co-creator with my friend Melos Hantani of Sephonie, which is a 3D platforming game about three Taiwanese biologists who are shipwrecked on this island with fantastical species, and they connect with each other and kind of their own memories and the ecosystem of the island. And this game was meaningful for me to make as a developer because I grew up playing a lot of 3D platformers and I really loved the genre. And one funny thing about them is a lot of them have this very like cartoonish understanding of culture and kind of different nationalities that is used as this like fun set dressing for the different levels. And so one interesting thing that we get to do with Sephonie is to explore culture in a different way in this kind of unusual pairing between a 3D platforming game and a kind of more nuanced narrative. And yeah, let's pass it along to Abi.
Hey, my name is Abi. My pronouns are he, him. I am the creative director and I'm working on a game called Venba, which is a narrative cooking game where you play as an immigrant Indian mother who moves to Canada in the late 1980s. Players have to restore lost recipes as they explore a story about family, love, loss, and more. To me, this game is very personal and intimate, and a lot of immigrant media that I've consumed and watched growing up, they usually focus on the perspective of the assimilated children, but I often found that the perspective of the parents was left untold, and sometimes their story is a lot cooler in my opinion, and that's sort of what I wanted to explore with Venba. Passing it along to Tanya.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tanya Kan. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the creative director and executive producer of Vivid Foundry. We're based in Toronto, Canada. And we are creating Solace State, which is what basically happens as you try to hack to bring hope in the midst of a militarized, controlled biotech society. This fiction is basically a 3D visual novel where you play as Chloe, who, in her journey into the city of Abraxa, you try to solve mysteries by making friends and also connect with protesters to try to bring about more freedoms. But the choices that you make may actually change the outcome of that, and hopefully you heal yourself along the way. So the reason that I really wanted to explore this is really to talk about intergenerational trauma, but also just to feel a little bit more connected as someone who is from a diasporic background, and really just see how folks feel when they feel kind of vulnerable and foreign in different situations. And another aspect of this is I've really felt like I grew up with my queerness through exploring this game's development. So I'm very excited to share this with you.
Oh, my name is Remy Siu, and I go by the he, him pronouns. I'm the creative director at Sunset Visitor Studios.
And my name's Natalie Tin Yin Gan, and I go by she, her, hers. I am one of the writers at Sunset Visitor Studios that is based on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations.
Our game is 1000 Times Resist, a sci-fi narrative adventure game where you play as a clone, worshipping the last surviving human, the All-Mother. When a dangerous rumor shatters your faith, you phase through time and memory to expose a 1,000-year-old lie. The game is set over multiple generations and leaps between the past, the present, and an impossible future.
And why this premise is meaningful to us is because Remy and I have worked together for a long time now, and throughout that time we've yearned to intertwine stories of the Hong Kong diaspora with magical realism and formal experimentation, because our background is actually in the performing arts. We're always interested in seeing how our characters' emotional decisions play against the backdrop of what their ancestors lived and the trajectories of their migrations.
That is so exciting. I'm just staring and staring at the screen and just being very excited about our respective games. So I'm just going to jump into some of our questions. So let's start off with, as members of our diasporic communities, we're constantly in a state of remembering and forgetting. So what lived experiences do you try to translate to your characters and their relationship with the game's world? And do these manifest in narrative or game design or both? So maybe Abby,
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
let you.
Yeah, I really like this question because I think it is a question we all struggle with. Like, what do you remember and what do you forget? And to me, this is at the core of what Venba is about. So, to give an example, Venba is put in a situation where she has to move to Canada, but she really misses home. She always looks at Canada as a temporary home, and she has a career back home as a teacher, and it's a job she's passionate about. But in Canada, she can only be a supply teacher due to language barriers and cultural barriers, and never being fully assimilated. So for her, remembering the culture, that's where she felt purpose, and that's where she felt her identity. It becomes very important to hold on to that, to remember those things, right? So when it comes to cooking different cuisines or different dishes, each one has strong memories for her, but the complete opposite experience is what Coven, her son, is going through, who was born here, and he's actually trying to forget, and he's trying to forget both consciously and subconsciously. For a lot of the times, immigrant children, when they grow up here, second generation children especially, they speak their mother tongue when they're at home because they're exposed to that. But as soon as they start going to school, they start forgetting, and it's not uncommon for us to forget our own language, to speak it in a very broken way, even though it is our mother tongue, right? So that's sort of the experience both of these characters have, and they're very different. And a lot of the game is Venba trying to remind Coven about her cultural experiences, the things she's passionate about, but it's something Coven never grew up with himself, right? And that, I feel like, causes a lot of the conflicts that we see in our families. And it's funny that the question asks if we explore this in narrative and game design, because there's literally a memory mechanic where Venba remembers her mother cooking these recipes as she tries to piece the recipe book together, and it does become a question of memories and how we pass these things on throughout the 7 levels that the game takes place on. Yeah.
I love that so
Thank you.
much. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to play Venba. So for us, for Solace State, we're definitely also balancing between narrative and game design as well. So in the game, Chloe is a hacker. There's a little bit of magical hacking rather than like you're actually at a computer terminal. So she does it almost instinctively, if you will, so without ever using any technologies. And one of the ideas is that she's actually like suppressing learning about the past as well and focusing on learning of the future, especially because there are a lot of kind of traditions that were troubling or that she would perceive as troubling that she really wants to move away from. And it's really that navigation of that. It's really hard to talk about this without spoiling it, really, but I'm trying. Where it's really about filtering through that information. So one of her skill sets is actually like constantly reading about other people's information. So she's really focused on taking a lot of different opinions and a lot of different ideas rather than just suffused in one dominant cultural idea. So that is one element that we really try to emphasize in the game design itself. She's never really just looking at one person's thoughts. She's looking at a multitude of different thoughts, and they're always tied to different locations and different neighborhoods. So some parts of that past is also like very much digitalized as well. So that element of science fiction is like, it's not just traversing now of reality through something that's physical or conversations that you have directly with somebody, but it's also through like these digital lens. So there is that question of, well, what is that kind of reality like? Can you actually change some of the meanings of things extracted from their place of origin? So there's a lot of that element of what is familiar and what is uncanny. So playing around with those kind of perspectives is something that we really try to do in Solace State, literally with the perspective of the camera not being like that of what a human eye would usually see. And so we're really playing around with that aspect of pulling back the walls. I'm being metaphorical, but it's also a little bit on the nose there. So another aspect of it is like she really hones in on, at the very beginning of the game, you're trying to find your best friend Rebecca. And so her flashback scenes is really like, she's very much focused on just Rebecca, Rebecca, Rebecca. And what they've shared with each other, everything else you'll notice is going to be like stripped aside. So there's that element of like rootlessness that hopefully you as a player, you can find much more embedded in. And so over the course of talking to many characters. And finally, we really try to choose all of the choices in the game associated with trust. So any choices based on the game has to be like, well, do you trust this information? Do you trust this person? What will build me a little bit more trust? So we're really trying to make sure that we're really harnessing that element. And in terms of design, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. But in terms of the digital faces, interfaces, I should say, they are designed to look both soft and hard at the same time. So there's a rigidity to them, but the colors are like muted palettes most of the time, and kind of soft hues. So yeah, that's really it. And I'm going to pass this to Marina.
So we have 3 main characters in Sephonie, and I describe them as Taiwanese biologists, but interestingly, they each are from, in a sense, or living in 3 different countries. So one is Taiwanese American, and one is Taiwanese Japanese, and one lives in Taiwan. And one kind of tool that we've found for talking about the game recently is there's this like academic concept that Melos came across. I think the person who came up with it is Jane Yamashiro, and it's this idea of a global ancestral group and a way of thinking about a country like Taiwan or Japan, not necessarily as like this one place from which like people emanate and like are more or less close to, but as like this node that connects different people's complex like experiences of ancestry. I just wanted to shout out an interesting talk that Melos did, that he did like a transcript blog post called Crafting Ludo Ancestry. And that kind of relates this idea of ancestry to the way that we engage with media like games. And then in terms of the design of the game, there's some interesting kind of resonance with Venba and Solace State from what I'm hearing, where there are these, in order to kind of balance this very like video gamey 3D platforming section with some of the narrative elements, there are these mind share sequences that occur after the kind of like boss puzzle battle type things. And those are, at least some of them happen in these 3D kind of diorama scenes where the camera like flips around through the same scene, but you see different aspects of it for the kind of memories being revealed of each character. And I think that was an interesting way that kind of connects to perhaps my own experience of narrative in I don't know, possibly as like a diasporic experience where the characters aren't it's like a particular kind of poetic prose style that's different from the rest of the game, where it's not really dialogue, it's not really the character explaining all the details of their own story, it's them kind of musing about their personal experiences internally, and then because of the kind of like surrealist sort of magical stuff that's happening on this island, they're being witness to each other's internal thoughts, but they're speaking in ways that it would be really maybe difficult for them to be that vulnerable or open directly to each other. So that's probably good for now, and I'll pass it along to Remy and Natalie.
Cool, thank you, Marina. I love this notion of a global ancestral group, and I think it's nice that you bring that up, because when I think about the lived experiences that we were trying to translate through our characters in our game, 1000 Times Resist, there is that element of maybe the things that we can't run from. So a certain kind of inevitable inheritance. And sometimes that looks like intergenerational trauma and baggage. And sometimes that's like a deeper intelligence and knowledge and access to maybe to imagery and other things. Knowledge is that different types of knowledge, like the ways that we echo our ancestors, the way that we are related to them, and that perhaps it's not so, maybe there's more of a collapsing of those dimensions. And I think that is evoked in the time jumping game mechanic that we have. And then, it's interesting, Abhi, you had kind of touched on this, like the remembering and the forgetting, and how some of that is active and some of that is passive. And so I feel like in writing this particular game, thinking a lot about the ways that, forgetting is active, forgetting as survival, assimilation as survival. And then on the other side, I think about remembering as defiance, and, as diaspora, as first-gen diaspora, like what do we become very protective of? What our parents might have had to shed and let go of in order to just get by and not be, kind of make that heartbreak your status quo. I think being the kids of those parents, kind of like having a different kind of worms to pick and choose, like what is our legacy piece? What do we want to carry forward? And what of what we've inherited do we actually want to shed? And then I think maybe a final piece I'll mention is what is true for us as members of the diaspora, particularly of the Hong Kong diaspora, is this desire. I think we're often chasing this sensation of a desire to return to a place that you cannot return, and whether that's for legal reasons or political reasons, or that place just doesn't exist anymore, or perhaps that place never existed. And so kind of like teasing out the sinews and the messiness of that, and how it sits in our bodies and in our guts. Maybe I'll pass it on to Remy.
Yeah, I'm sorry. One of the reasons that we really wanted to kind of focus on some of these Hong Kong diasporic stories in a sci-fi setting was it does allow us to ask the question of whether we do actually see a future for ourselves, whether there will be a continuation of some sort of cultural strand in that way, because we do see it dissipating in so many ways, and we do see it kind of being actively worked out right now. And so in a lot of ways, there's no answers to that for us. And kind of making 1000 Times Resist has been kind of actively, for us as writers, processing these questions. And we made those game mechanics almost for ourselves as well, to kind of be able to move, say like in a single physical space, be able to jump around different time periods, to be able to kind of look at it from different perspectives, and also kind of encounter, our parents, our grandparents, and the various states that they may have been in along either a process of migration or assimilation, so that we can kind of put that in context with other thematics in the game. And for us, it's really just trying to process, do we see a future where we get to continue, where we recognize ourselves in this way. I pass it on. Oh, I will.
Is that the next question now?
Quickly pause here. Yeah, this is the next question, but I'm going to pause here because, Tanya, we cannot hear you.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
I'm
okay.
so sorry. I muted
You're
my
great.
own mic
Okay,
at the
that's
very
okay.
top here.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that is so incredibly profound that I already want to have individualized full conversations with, I think, each of these stories that you're building, from the focus on just the incredible focus on like what is history and how can we really find it meaningful for us as individuals as well as a collective group. How can we sustain those conversations, I think, is really incredibly meaningful to me as well. And I think this actually is a great segment into talking about how we craft our narratives, and some of the emotional journeys that our characters go on. So I'll ask about crafting our narratives and why do we tell exactly these moments with these characters' lives? What emotional journeys are we exploring? How do characters grow in their hope and heartbreak? Is it even a simultaneous growing of hope and heartbreak? And how do we process and grapple with this when we each conceptualize the idea of authenticity and even cultural specificity? So, I'm the first one up. So I think in this, I think it is simultaneous for me, that you can have this multitude of thinking that you can hope for a future, live in the present, and also wonder about the past. What can I take with me in the past as well? I think what Natalie said spoke to me so much that I'm like still processing it, I think, so much. And I'm part of the Hong Kong diaspora as well. But at the same time, for me, I might not look it as a mixed race person. So there's also that kind of confusion. And just as an aside, we definitely have some coded mixed race, mixed ethnic background individuals in the game of Solace State itself. So I think there's that very much that grappling of like, can I actually be hopeful when I'm this sad about not knowing the past? And I think over time there is almost like that fear of utopia. Like who is that utopia for? If you have a utopic idea, who is it for? And that's something we definitely do explore, because in studying for Solace State, I've looked at basically quite a number of modern protest movements and seeing how they have been successes, but also sometimes not been successes or haven't quite fulfilled the original mandates or dreams that the protesters had wanted for. For example, when I first began this project, Euromaidan is seen as just an overwhelming success. And I think in a way, Ukraine's Euromaidan is very much that, because they were able to then withstand so much of political aggression. So there is that aspect of talking about these modern movements over time and how are they being recognized today. So, but so much of that country has changed so significantly, and it's very heartbreaking. And of course, I don't even have any national ties in that respect. And yeah, it's like how are these people's voices still resonant decades afterwards? How does that how is that meaningful? So in a way, working through this has been such a process insofar that Chloe, the main protagonist of the game Solace State, she's still grappling with a lot of hope for the future, but she's still healing. And I think that why we're telling the story now is I think it's so necessary and accessible to people who might be like, I'm bombarded by absolutely everything from AI to just news of war to not getting the news because social media is not emphasizing that anymore, or it's feeding me into this pipeline of very, very specific news and not necessarily something that is as deeply engaged as maybe once upon a time I would want to access. So we're really looking at that aspect because of how much digitality Chloe seems to be able to access as well. So can we even perceive intergenerational trauma from the perspective that maybe some previous generations might want to be perceived? Or how does that matter? How is that valued? So definitely questioning that quite a bit. And a lot of the times I think for Solace State, we're really emphasizing you can't just heal first and put the future on hold. It kind of happens when it happens. I can't just say I don't want to think about anything about my identity and gender or anything. I just want to figure out my cultural identity and like where I stand as a person of Hong Kong diaspora. It doesn't work that way. I tried so hard and I just ended up hurting myself. And so there is that kind of, I think overall, we're really trying to emphasize this idea of hope without necessarily stepping into the uncanniness of utopias as well. And that like the element of friendship is like what stays with people, I think, more than anything else. Across all of these things that I've read about movements and so forth, it's the friendships at the end of the day. It's the connections you make. I know it's so... I know it's so pithy, but it's so true. It's more than physical items. That's why we don't really emphasize that. We emphasize conversations. We emphasize memories. We do have a foodie. Food is so important to one of our characters, the person who's local to our imaginary city, because it's the place where people gather, and I think that's so important. And it's how can the city then become more familiar? That's really the process. It's all about these conversations. It's about where people gather. So yeah, I think of really authenticity and cultural specificity comes from being able to question it as well. And I think I'll leave on that note.
All right.
And pass the one to
Marina.
Thanks.
So in terms of like what is the moment that we're showing in the game, we're kind of using the fact that it's set on an island in a way to sort of start from this sense of like isolation and newness where the people from their own spaces are kind of pulled out of each of their contexts and have this kind of like abstract space in which to like renegotiate how they feel about those past places. And so in a sense, there's this sort of emotional arc of like a summer camp where people are like pulled out of their normal contexts and like have to like bounce off of each other and develop these really intense emotional connections quickly that are then ultimately severed, and they have to kind of go back to real life and try to sort of understand what that experience meant. And we're also trying to question a little bit like the fact that the island as a concept does feel like, you know, abstract and removed from sort of like politics and history, when in reality, like the ways that like islands work on like a geopolitical level often like makes them very specifically like points of like conflict and contestation. And so that also kind of plays into some of the themes that where the game is like exploring the history of Taiwan and Okinawa. And in terms of yeah, like authenticity. So in working on this game and then also our future unannounced project, which has involved me researching kind of my grandparents' Japanese American generation, uh, I think something interesting that I find is that, like, as an artist working with history and incomplete knowledge, you're constantly doing an act of kind of like reinterpreting and like understanding and misunderstanding, having, different opinions than, my parents' generation or things like that. And I think that's like a really normal and natural part of culture for all people, but that it becomes highly charged when you're, a minority or part of a diasporic experience, because there's this pressure to either be like an authentic authority or to be someone who has assimilated and lost authority, rather than this recognition that, each person's experience is them being a part of culture or like creating culture in whichever way that means. And that doesn't mean that it's always neutral, but it's just kind of like an interesting way to think about it. And one thing that I compare it to a little bit in my mind is like how there's been this wave on the internet of kind of like neoconservative, like trad culture type stuff. And so that's like an interesting thing in that that's like for, a re-mythologizing and a misunderstanding of like past like whiteness and stuff like that. And so it's interesting to compare how kind of everyone goes through this process of trying to understand what their history means to them. And yeah, I'll pass it along to Natalie and Remy.
Thanks. Yeah, what emotional journeys our characters are trying to explore. I scribbled this down. It was the first time I thought about it in this way, but I think something for sure that's present for me is a kind of maybe a contending with don't hold me to this, but I'm going to say intergenerational compassion. And so I think we've been talking about memory and history and historicity and how it plays in the today and what happens when we know who we came from and what our ancestors experienced. And then Marina, to hear you speak about like how normal and natural and important and necessary it is for our lived experiences to be different than the last generation, than the previous generation, and that even if we were to live this, if we were to go through the same actions, say, that we would still have different points of view, different opinions and perspectives on, is this the way to be? And I'm just sitting with how cool that is so messy, how significant and useful it is that we are in dissonance with previous values, and that's kind of a part of, being part of actively living in culture that is being made at this moment as we speak without us necessarily knowing it. And so, so I guess I just reflect on that. And then something that, Tanya, you said earlier, it really resonated with me, this like, how do we address hope without it stepping into this uncanny utopia? Because when I think about, coming back to this authenticity question, I think that's something that I'm quite sensitive to. And then I've just been reflecting on like the duality, especially in our game, especially in how much we are bringing ourselves to it, like how hope and grief are almost the same side of a coin. And that in some ways hope is grief in motion, in action, in movement. And then I'm like, why magical realism? Why speculative fiction? Why fiction in general? And I'm like, fiction as hope, fiction as a place for us to activate our grief. And to animate it and to dance in the poetics of it. I'm like, that is what we do. That is what we do. That makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, how does our process grapple with the concept of authenticity? Maybe just to summarize that, I feel like yes. Oh, maybe I'll quickly say also there's just a lot of media about POC grief, and I'm like, and POC trauma, and that's something that we seem very comfortable with, and so I think maybe that's also why there's an interest for us in like, and what next? What do we do with that grief? What do we do with that longing? How do we participate presently as opposed to hang out in nostalgia? So giving it agency, I suppose, giving it political agency. Yeah, I think what I want to say about authenticity is that for us, it generally means like messy and complicated characters. And I think we spent a lot of time wanting to craft marginalized protagonists who are not free of sin, of damage, of capacity for discriminating and othering others. Like, it doesn't put you above anything. And yeah, so I think authentic for us kind of means, at least for me, in writing, means unresolved. Leaving a door open. When we watch media, for example, about like, say, the Chinese Canadian experience, where you've got that cultural clash between generations, where the parents and the kids are fighting, and then they hold themselves accountable to their errors, and then they hug it out. Like, I think for us, this kind of closure and this cadence feels disingenuous to our lived experiences. So I think our interest is like, how can this unresolvedness be generative? And then maybe I'll hand it to Remy. You are muted.
I am muted. I'm now not muted anymore.
Yes,
Is that correct?
Yes. Speak your truth now.
Okay. Yes, I can speak it now. This process that you're speaking about, I think, is mirrored in the way that the game is structured and what we're trying to do with kind of the timeline mechanic, where sometimes we have large spaces with few timelines or few time periods that you can visit, and sometimes we have very small spaces with many timelines that you can visit. And this just jamming out loud here, because trying to think about what you were saying, Natalie, and what everybody was saying, is that why did we even drift towards that mechanic in the first place? Largely, first, it was from a narrative perspective. Like, we really wanted to feel like we were in the middle of this detritus of stuff, and that this existed on a way that we could leave these kind of intervals between these different points where people are people are feeling or experience a certain thing, and then be able to travel over these kind of conceptual gaps to form strange meanings and for the poetics to kind of emerge from those missing kind of bits of information as we traverse a very traverse time, I guess. I was going to say but and part of this authenticity too is this unresolvedness. I think I spoke about it a little bit earlier. This kind of sense of unresolvedness with specifically, I guess, for us as Hong Kong diaspora, the city of Hong Kong, and knowing it and maybe not knowing it, and in this general sense that it may already be gone. Whatever we thought that we were thinking of. Like, everybody really has a very different situation, and maybe it was a very short period of time that occurred in the 20th century. This maybe 2-3 decades, what we're thinking about. So it was very, very intermittent, or not very long. But I always think about this headline that I had read, that to know Hong Kong is to know continuous heartbreak, and kind of how that feels to search in various ways for experiences that you're like, oh, maybe that is it. Maybe that is what maybe this will heal us. But actually, it when you look closer at it, it's almost fantasy in a way that, maybe we'll just take the fantasy to a certain extent sometimes.
Kind of satiating sometimes. We just go to dim sum and we're like, we feel okay right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll pass it on to Abhi.
Thank you. Yeah, I really feel the difference in going glass because you guys are all touching on so many great things that I want to say. But it's great. It's fantastic. So, why, why did we set the game where it's set? What are these moments? So actually, Venba starts in the 1980s, right when they immigrated, and then it extends all the way to 2010s. Every level skips time forward. And the reason I wanted to do that is because I thought the idea they live in the same house, they eat the same food, but their relationships to each other, to the food, and to the house keeps changing. And it's nice to have something constant. You need something constant to measure how something changes, right? So, and the idea of using food and the house to measure that was very compelling to me. So, as time goes on, her son gets increasingly assimilated, and that's increasingly more painful for her because she starts to feel foreign to him, and actually. He starts to feel foreign to her. And as a mother, she has a lot to offer. But when there's a literal language barrier between her and her son, it can be very painful, right? And that's, it's almost a cliche to say that food is a way to show a lot of affection, but in a lot of these families that I've observed, it is the only way to still communicate, right? And what I've noticed is with assimilated children, they may change their names, they may forget their language, but food is something that's the last thing to leave them. It's the one thing that always finds their way into them because it's so personal and they've grown up eating it. It's hard to, you've developed your palate. It's part of you now, right? And so that's what we're trying to show here. And Benba's heartbreak really it comes from. She being so passionate about her culture, her roots, but not being able to share that with her own son. But that being said, when we talk about authenticity, this is something that's super important to me, and I think we talk a lot about who can tell what stories, and I think that discussion is very important. But one thing that's been troubling me is that the idea that because I'm from a certain ethnicity, I'm immediately qualified to tell that story. Because I think that's dangerous also. Just because we are from it doesn't mean that we know. And there's a lot of burden on ourselves to do that research properly. And for me, the research never stopped in Venba because I was just so worried about. It's not. Venba, I think, is the first time it's a game about Tamil people, and it might be the first time there's a game like this, and definitely I think it is the first time a game like this has such an audience. So the fact that this serves as an introduction is both a privilege but also a burden. But I think the amount of research you have to do to show a small piece, like I have to research the 99, like 100%, but I might show only 1% of it. But I need to research the 99% to know that I can show the 1%, so that I can be comfortable omitting it. And once I know that, it becomes mine to like meld and shape and change. But I need to know all of it, right? But at the same time, authenticity can also be toxic. I think because in a lot of our families. The conflict is about authenticity. It's I'm living the Tamil way. I'm living the way I'm supposed to be living, but you're not, right? So and Benba's journey is about letting go of that idea of authenticity and accepting. When we grow up here, we're far separated from the origins. So it's up to us to define what it means, what authenticity means to us, and that also is valid. So it's dangerous. I think it's two sides of the same coin. But the balancing act is essentially what Venba has to learn and let go through the course of the game.
Oh wow. I every single time, I think there's so much to respond to. Would you mind if I had kind of respond to what you said, if that's okay, before jumping to the next question? Oh, yeah, I love what you said about the conflict of authenticity and how it, like, between multiple groups of people, multiple, like, whatever their background is, maybe generationally, how to present culturally. And I definitely forgot to mention this as well, regarding, like, how can I represent something that's so violently unfair when you have unarmed protesters on one side and you have militarized access of capital and entrenched politics and governance on the other hand, all the way up to the national level, and also potentially enshrined in law or moving towards being enshrined in law. And I definitely, it resonates so much with me about, like, well, how can we represent that in a fair way? And I think I really dug myself into, like, that's why Solace State took so long, dug myself into a hole that even if I interview people on the front lines and chat with them and go to their offices and, go on the streets with them, it's never going to be exactly the same experience. One-to-one, I think for me, after a while, I had to actually be really just uncomfortable with the fact that I have that privilege of, effectively, I'm not going to be on the front lines in the same way, but hopefully, people who have taken the time to engage with me are going to be okay with how they've changed my life, basically. How I'm kind of reshaping a story. I think before I started this the interview process, I thought, okay, the game's just going to end on one peaceful protest. That's it. And I thought a lot of films do that. For example, Battle of Algiers, that's a very famous film that focuses on, I just gave away a very old film, ending. It ends on the protest, but it's like, what happens after? What happens when the curtains fall? That's the story that I'm interested in. So, yeah, and protesters kind of learn from each other as well. So, like, for example, I'm going to go back to the Euromaidan protest. That's definitely shared in terms of its tactics with different groups. And Black Lives Matter have been shared with many different groups as well that are contemporary to them. And there is no really best way, but I think there is quite a lot of infighting about what's the best type of protester. There are people who do definitely discuss that quite ad nauseum. But yeah, I think perhaps LudoNarraCon will allow us to do 2 hours of talks next time. I'm so sorry. I maybe should skip the next question because or answering the next question, but I'll let everyone else talk about this one. We have one final question left, which is, how do different entrenched systems of oppression and assimilation affect the characters in your games? And how might they respond differently to those forces? Where do they find common ground? Do they become complicit? Do they ask difficult questions? And why is it important for us to explore this in our game? And Remy, thank you for actually kind of shaping this question into its form. I think really emphasizing, like, do they become complicit or finding common ground? Yeah, that's really nice. Okay, and I'll let, I think, who's the first? Yes, Marina, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, Marina, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I think that one thing that was important for us in this game was kind of complicating some of the questions around the idea of like oppression and assimilation and marginalization, because we're trying to depict these characters who are like coming from different countries and in different cultural contexts. And I think, Melis and I are both grew up in the U.S. and are sort of a part of this like Asian American experience in a sense. But we're also trying to think through how, think beyond kind of the experience of like maybe being a minority in the U.S. and thinking about how these different countries that we focus on in the game of like Japan and Taiwan and the U.S. have different relationships of power to each other that kind of like overlap in weird ways. And it's, not always this like American context of like, oh, Asian, that's like a minority or something like that. And so, for instance, one character, the character who lives in Tokyo, but has like Taiwanese ancestry, grapples kind of with how to understand his own position in sort of Japan's like colonial history. And yeah, that's left like fairly open-ended, but it's kind of seems like an interesting and important thing to explore, and maybe helpful for us to kind of like look beyond just maybe like rethink how we feel about ourselves in maybe a more like global way or in a more complicated way. I'll pass it along to Remy and Natalie. Thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting premises that we get to live in is that most of the main characters in our game, 1000 Times Resist, they're clones of the All-Mother and of Iris. And so very early on we do get to a certain extent, reduce this kind of fictional space specifically about Iris's memories, her relationship with her mom, her mom's relationship to her mom, and seeing how some of the decisions that were made in, amongst a backdrop of a setting of having to leave Hong Kong for reasons that we've seen in the world, and kind of seeing how that is traced through Iris and then through to these clones and through to these and how they're very disconnected from the thing itself, and how they may interpret it each on their own kind of occasions. And very early on, I think the writers, we tried to define our characters by placing them on a spectrum of how they may challenge authority or institution and what tools they may employ, just based on their personality or based on their demeanor. Some are really brash, some are very naive, some are calculating, careful, waiting, and really trying to ask ourselves that these are all various things, various persona that we are code switching into sometimes to deal with immediate things that are in front of us. So, yeah, I'll pass this one on to Natalie here.
Oh, did I have other things to say?
I apologize.
That sounds about right. I had a thought. I lost it. Yeah. Maybe we just thought that this kind of contesting was important to offer to a player experience because the medium allows for such an embodied engagement that you really take on the stakes, and you have the opportunity to see and understand why everyone's coming to the table the way that they are, and that just felt like an intimate, and it felt like there was a lot of charge and possibility for that kind of engagement. Yeah. I'll pass it back to Abi.
I really like this question. because when I wrote these characters, for me, the common thread that was going through my head was like no one's really at fault here for the emotions and the conflict that they're having. It's something bigger than them that's putting them in this situation. The conflict is inevitable, I think, right? And we have the parents, Venba and her husband, are almost humiliated on a day-to-day basis in a thousand different ways, by not knowing the language, by not you know they used to be somebody back home, but they feel like they're nobodies here, and that's a big hurt to your pride and ego. And with Venba especially, it leads to misplaced resentment, in my opinion. But on the opposite side, and it's funny, I've noticed this when players play the initial levels, their sympathy towards Coven is very little, and it's their son, and they're like, "Oh, why is he like that? Why does he not just eat the food?" But also it's important to know that Venba was set in the 1980s, and what I've seen is, I'm 29 now, so I went to high school in before the 2006 to 2010, right? And the difference from then to going to high school now is humongous, right? The idea of Indian cuisine is more accepted, and like in that, like there's still South Indian cuisine. Nobody knows what that is yet, but it's dramatically different. So when I think about kids who went to school in the 1980s, it's a lot. It's even harder, right? So the pressures that the child feels to assimilate is huge, right? It's humongous, and it's a pressure that the parents are not sympathetic towards. They have their own guilt for like coming. It's funny. It's interesting. Even though they make this choice to leave and come here, the number one feeling that a lot of these parents feel is they feel guilt. They feel they're like, oh, I left my country behind, and to a lot of them, this is a temporary move. They always have plans to go back, which never really happens. But in their head, this is a temporary thing. And also the fact that when they move here, when they're in their 30s or 40s, it becomes much harder to assimilate. And a lot of times their friends are only each other and their family, right? Which is the complete opposite experience that the son has, where I think socially, every time he's incentivized to hide his identity, to cut away from his, to be as assimilated as possible, and that's rewarded more and more. So to me, I just see this. That's why I like this question a lot more, because I think it shines a light on what the real issue here is. And these exact two same characters, if it was a different time period, different place, they may have a very different relationship, right? And that's what I wanted to explore in Venba. I'm passing it on to Tanya.
Thank you so much. I really love what you said, Abhi, about how, like, there's just harm, but there's no real fault. And for us, that really resonates as well in Solace State. I like that, Remy, you asked the question of how do they become complicit. I think I might focus on that a little bit more in my answer. In Solace State, we have 31 fully illustrated characters who basically all have different types of intersections. Some are very privileged in wealth, for example, but still might not have that much access to certain kind of social capital. Others, there's a very strong element of socioeconomics at play, but there are also some characters where harm has been done systemically to them, just repeatedly, systemically. They're trapped, the only way to get out is really just from this biotech company where additional harm is done to them, but they think that they're climbing a ladder. And so really the thing that we want to emphasize with Solace State is like, even if harm has been done systemically, the way that this character then relates and tries to either break the chain or basically try to reduce pain rather than continue that forward with almost like a spread of ink, right? Is really so key to how these characters move in the world. And I like, Abi, what you mentioned about like incentivize to basically assimilate constantly. And I think that's really something that really resonates with Solace State as well, insofar as that the characters are really kind of, some of them are very incentivized to harm themselves as well as each other. And these might be people, communities that they grew up with. And then therefore they become complicit in that system of continuing that. And a big aspect of that is really with that militia, with even the militia has taken over the police station, and thus everything's just concentrated power and decidedly disastrous, because it's also a focus on human bodies with biotech as well. So we really think that nonetheless, Chloe's kind of magical hacking abilities is really a way for us to question a little bit more about, well, can you like look at that person's stories but still hold this person accountable? So that's really something that we really want to explore further. And I hope, like, you know, maybe if you think certain choices don't give enough kind of direction back, that there are other opportunities in the game in terms of choices to push back in different ways. So that's really what we're exploring. Like, it's not really necessarily a right away kind of consequence system that we're building in terms of responses that protesters can manage. It's actually like a very entrenched, ongoing, long movement. So it's like pushing back, and of course the other side pushes back, and it's really such like a game of long-term survival. But also beyond just survival, there's also that kind of thriving amongst friendships and exploring healing and exploring selfhood. So I think that's where we really want to ask these difficult questions. And I think we're more thinking like, oh, this is more a conversation starter, because we don't want this to be like, you know, that's it, that's the end. We actually hope that, you know, there are some folks who are like, maybe movements could go in a different way, and that's what it should be like. So yeah, that's my answer. So I think this is pretty much our time, almost. So we should probably all wrap up and just talk a little bit about where to find us, where to wishlist us. Of course, our games are going to be available on Steam, or are already available on Steam. So our links will be available, and you should definitely check out the games on Steam and also on other platforms as well. So I'll let Remy and Natalie take it away with where we can find you and your game.
Yeah, you can wishlist us on Steam and play the demo today at LudoNarraCon. And follow us on Twitter at 1000xresist. So 1000xresist on Twitter. Thank you.
Yeah, so for Venba, we are on Steam. We're coming soon. We're also on a bunch of other platforms, PS5, Xbox, and the Nintendo Switch. We're also coming on Game Pass. But you can wishlist us on Steam, follow us on Twitter at Venba Game, and the same handle on TikTok also.
Brilliant. So you can wishlist us on Steam for Solace State. That's not Solid Snake. It's Solace. I cannot say this ever again. Solace State, not Solid State, not the drive, but hopefully there is a drive towards more equitable movements. That's where that pun gets past that door. And you can follow us on Vivid Foundry on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and also we have the discord.gg/Vivid Foundry. That's where you can find us. And yeah, thank you so much.
And our main game tweets are done by Melis. That's at Han_Tani on Twitter. And Sephonie's been out for a while on Steam and other platforms, coming soon to consoles. And yeah, follow the Twitter for updates on our new game. It's exciting.
You are muted, Tanya, I believe. Or the audio is.
So yes, that's great. I think the mods will be posting all of our social media links and wish lists down below, so please be sure to check it out. Thank you so much, LudoNarraCon and fellow Traveler, for organizing this. We had such a blast, and honestly, I could have this conversation like every year, forever, I think, with all of you. I'm so excited for your games. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Here, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.